People listening who have addiction are going to recognize this. The first time you took something, it was like the lights turned on. The world was in color. The birds were chirping. Who knew birds chirped? It was like, all of a sudden, this is the best thing ever. Now I know what's always been missing.
Welcome, everybody. It's Katie with Ria Health, and today I'm here with Dr. Howard Wetsman. Howard is an addictionologist with over 25 years of experience in studying and treating addiction. And Howard, as I understand it, I've been following you for a while. You have it as your own goal or personal mission to end addiction as a problem in the U.S. within the next 30 years. Which is an incredible goal and something that I can definitely get on board with. So I'm just excited to be chatting with you today to learn more about your work in the realm of addiction. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So I just want to dive right into it. For viewers who are watching this who might not be familiar with you or your work, could you tell us a bit about you and your work in the realm of addiction?
Yeah, I'm not sure where to start though. So I started, I guess the place to start is the beginning. I started pretty typically as a psychiatrist who learned almost nothing about addiction in psychiatric training. What I did learn about addiction in medical school was that it's not a disease, and if you find someone with addiction in your practice, kick him out because he's only going to break your heart. And then when I got to psychiatry training, they said, well, there is this thing called addiction, but it's really not our problem, except that a lot of depressed people get it and a lot of personality disorder people get it, and we treat those things, and so we'll treat that, and the addiction part, it'll just fix itself. And that just didn't work for me. And so I was in the Navy and saw a lot of addiction and knew there had to be a better way. And oddly, started treating addiction before I realized that I needed to be in recovery too. So I sent a lot of people to treatment, and then one day said, you know, this isn't good. This should work for me too. And amazingly, it does. But there's still something about everybody going to recovery as the only way to do it, which didn't work for a lot of my patients. And I had to find a way to get people to go into a recovering lifestyle. And so I found out a lot about the neurobiology of addiction. And through that, found out that it is quite possible for us to end it as a problem in American life if we just look at it correctly. Sorry about my dog. She just walked in and she's going to make a little noise.
We love dogs. So that's fascinating. You said that you realized you yourself had to be in recovery. Can you say more there?
Yeah, so I had my last drink in 1988 and was sober by people's definition, but abstinent, I guess, is a better definition. But not really sober. I was overeating. Ended up getting kicked out of the Navy because I was fat. Huh. In fact, I'm one of the few people I know who got kicked out of the Navy. One of the few people in Overeaters Anonymous I know who lost a job because of their weight. Oh. So then when I realized that, you know, this was addiction too, then I had a solution I'd never had before. And in the Navy, I was taught, no, you're treating addiction. That's just willful disobedience to us. This is addiction over here, but what you've got is you're fat. So it wasn't until I, you know, found that solution that worked for me. And unfortunately, in this country, we see addiction as limited to drugs and alcohol.
Yeah.
And so when people say they want to solve an addiction problem, they're really talking about drug use or alcohol use, and they don't really mean the disease of addiction.
Yeah.
So we go after these crises, and they keep coming up as new crises, and we're confused as to why this is all happening. And it's really because we've never addressed the underlying brain illness of addiction.
Yeah. Yeah, that leads me into my next question then. So what is addiction? How do you define it? I know I've heard you say how people can have addictions and not be using drugs or alcohol, or they can have an addiction and be using drugs and alcohol. So can you please explain what you mean here by addiction and I guess versus substance abuse?
Got it. So the word addiction comes from Latin, and it essentially means attachment beyond the will. And it's really the best definition of addiction I've ever heard anyone say, is attachment beyond my will. Most people I know with addiction are not having a good time.
Yeah.
Nobody's happy having addiction. People who don't have addiction, who look at people with addiction, think, oh, that guy's just doing it because he's enjoying it. But I don't know anybody with addiction who's really enjoying it.
Yeah.
It's miserable, but we can't stop because the attachment to the thing is beyond our will. Now, once you realize the neurobiology of attachment is involved, you can look at where that is, and then you have to understand, why is it that normal people don't get it? And so imagine for someone without addiction, the landscape of attachment is rolling hills. There's a little bit of attachment everywhere. You can have a nice meal, you could be with a good friend, pet your dog, look at a sunset, and everything is enjoyable so that you could let go of anything that's happening because the next thing is going to be just as good. If you don't have enough of a neurotransmitter in the brain called dopamine at the reward center, that rolling hill landscape becomes a flat desert. And then one day someone gives you something that pops the dopamine up to the point where it actually meets the reward line. And so your landscape is a flat desert with a mountain in it. And that mountain just attracts everything. And our life starts to revolve around that thing. And everything else becomes subservient to that thing. And it's actually our survival mechanisms that are built into the brain's reward system, because that system was not built to enjoy cocaine. That system was built to make babies, get in out of the rain, find good food, get shelter, provide for a community, and things that would keep us alive as a species and as individuals. So when that system is engaged, we go for that thing at a level of survival need. We look at someone with addiction and we say, doesn't he know he's going to kill himself doing that? His midbrain is saying, if you don't do that, you're going to die. So did I answer the question? Or
Yeah.
Sometimes I just go off into a tangent.
No, like what is addiction? And you're kind of framing it as it's really just about us seeking this reward of dopamine. And when we're not getting that from natural pleasures or things that otherwise would naturally produce them in life, addiction kind of becomes this thing that we place on a pedestal. Is that right?
Yes. And I think a lot of people believe, if you look at the current paradigm of addiction we have in this country, everyone is normal when they start. Everyone can get that normal pleasure from normally rewarding activities, but some people just choose to do something illegal or stupid, and then they get hooked, and we can blame them or not blame them, but that's up to us because we're generous or not generous. But they still did something. Mm-hmm. I'm going to take it a step further and say that while there are some people who were born normal and put in circumstances where they got hooked, okay, but that's actually very few people. When you think of everybody I've ever met with addiction, that's a very small percent. A larger group are people who were born normal but had stress that drove dopamine down low. And they basically had the phenotype of addiction, even though they didn't have the genes. And another large group are those people who were born with genetically low dopamine, and they didn't get a choice about whether they were going to live in rolling hills or a desert. And the first time, and this is people listening who have addiction are going to recognize this, the first time you took something, it was like the lights turned on. The world was in color. The birds were chirping. Who knew birds chirped? It was like all of a sudden, this is the best thing ever. Now I know what's always been missing. I hear that story all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But if we thought about addiction that way in America, we'd have gotten rid of it a long time ago. But we don't. We think everybody made a choice.
Yeah. No, that feels like it gets more to the root, the source of the issue. So can you speak then to what is it that's wrong with our current treatment system for addiction? I know you've talked about getting rid of the drug, it's getting rid of the substance, but not doing anything about the addiction or the disease of addiction, which resides in the brain. So
Yeah.
can you say more here?
So we've been focused on the effects and not the cause. And we look at the cause, and I mean, obviously, if you see a guy laying in a doorway with a bottle next to him and dirty clothes, you think, you having a good time? Okay. You think that guy, whatever caused that was the bottle right there. That caused it. He wouldn't be like that if he hadn't drank that. Well, that is, you could say that he wouldn't be drunk if he hadn't drank. But what was the cause if he drank? There's a lot that it could be, but we don't go far enough back. We just start with the first cause we can see. We don't think about what caused him to do that thing in the first place or pick up that. Because if you look at lab studies, it's actually hard to get a normal dopamine mammal to use a drug that raises dopamine.
Huh.
Everybody thinks, oh, dopamine's pleasure, and everybody would take it and take more of it. No, it's actually on it's the science part is called an inverse U-shaped curve. So at low dopamine, you have a very dysphoric, and I don't have any pleasure. And if I raise dopamine, my pleasure gets higher. And as I raise dopamine more, pleasure comes down again. And so we want to be in that window. More isn't always better. And so people try to get into that window and stay in that window. If you do a study on rats and you give the rat the opportunity to hit the lever to bring his dopamine up, they don't hit the lever and get high and go, oh, let me hit the lever and get higher. They hit the lever, the dopamine goes up, and when it starts to come down, they go back to the lever. It's not the high that causes the craving. It's the crash after the high. Yeah. So we just have these inaccurate ideas about cause and effect. And so we keep focusing on the effect instead of the cause. And no wonder over 100 years we haven't fixed this thing yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to build on what you were saying, I know I've heard you talk about treating people for the underlying illness so people don't need to use that substance anymore. Right. So can you elaborate a bit here on what this would look like? Because our current treatment system is all about getting at the substance first.
Right. So if you, first it would require a different kind of assessment. So my treatment center that I don't have anymore, but when I had it, like every other licensed treatment center in the country, has to take a substance history. I mean, if you didn't take that substance history and fill out that, now I got two of them, so one's calling in. So if you didn't fill out that square of all, what's the substance? When's the first time I ever used it? What's the most I ever used? When's the last time I used it? What's my use been like in the last 6 months? You fill out that thing for all the substances, and everybody thinks you took a history. If we hadn't done that, we wouldn't have kept our license. But I didn't have the doctor do that, or even the counselor do that. We had the intake person do that because it's a complete waste of time. And so when the patient got to someone clinical, they said, the first thing we asked them was a set of symptoms based on dopamine tone, and said, to basically ask them, how are you doing right now this minute on these? How are you feeling? That really just taught them what those symptoms were. And then we said, go back to before you ever used a drug or alcohol or anything you think affected you with addiction, and tell me which of those symptoms did you have? And we take them through again. And it was like 80% of people could identify 4 or 5 of these 7 symptoms and so, yep, I had that. Yep, I had that. So now we're having a completely different conversation. Within 5 minutes of sitting down with a clinical person who treated addiction, the patient, instead of being focused on drugs, was focused on what was I like when I was a kid? What did the first drug do? What was wrong with me before the first drug?
Yeah.
And most importantly, we said, before that alcohol, when you were 10, what did you do to feel that feeling before then? Oh, I overate, or, I kind of felt that way when I pushed people in the playground, or I wanted to make good grades and make my mom smile. And people would identify these things that have been seen in the literature as causing the release of dopamine: power over others, sleeping late, or sleeping late, being sleep deprived, sweets, making people smile, being the center of attention. All these things are in the scientific literature as being essentially drugs, but nobody will ever talk about them. So basically, by the time we did the intake, the patient has a completely new understanding of how they got to where they are. They have a new vocabulary about it. And that was before we even started talking about the genetics.
Yeah.
So that's kind of it. I can't tell you every way it looks because it's a complicated thing, but how it would look is completely different than how treatment looks today.
Wow. So, as I mentioned earlier in the call, I know you have a vision to end addiction. Can you say more here on what this looks like for you and the model you use and have used?
Yeah, so I sold that treatment center believing that the people who bought it were going to take the model and turn it into a national platform faster than we could do. We had that goal, and they came and they said, we can do that faster, and I believed them. That didn't happen. Why it didn't happen isn't important, but it didn't happen. And so a lot of the how we did it got sold with the treatment center. And so I don't even own my book anymore.
Wow.
But I can still tell people, I just can't sell a book. It's still on Amazon. I just don't make any money off of it. And so we need a treatment system, not just a treatment center. We need a treatment system so good, so fast, and so inexpensive that no one would use any other treatment system. It's not about force. We'll never have to force anybody to use it. If we make it good and quick and inexpensive, no one would want to use any other system. And I do believe that we could do that if we had the will. Most people believe you can't make money doing that. Therefore, why would I do it? And the few people in the treatment industry who've asked me how to do this, and I've told them, they've all said, but that will cut my bed days. And I would say, yes. Not only that, it'll cut your beds because very few people need residential treatment anymore when you do it this way. And they said, but that's where I get my money. And that's what insurance pays for. And so there are a lot of things in the way, but we need that treatment. Okay, then that's for people who have addiction. But how are we going to prevent it? Well, we've tried Just Say No since 1913, one way or the other. We've tried no. Actually, 1905 was the Pure Food and Drug Act, when cocaine couldn't be in Coca-Cola anymore. So we've tried Just Say No. We've been blaming substances for over 100 years, and it just hasn't worked. What the real way to prevent this is to recognize that these symptoms that we talk about can actually be seen in children. They just don't look like beer drinking or drug shooting. I mean, yes, you're right. 5-year-olds are not shooting heroin in kindergarten, but they do look like low dopamine kids. Now, interestingly, it's hard to tell the difference between a really high dopamine kid and a really low dopamine kid. Just remember that inverse U-shaped curve. You look the same on both ends of the curve. But so some of these people are going to need treatment to go this way, and some of these people are going to need treatment to go this way, which means we have to individualize this beyond what the behavior is and individualize the why behind the behavior. Part of that is why I have an interest in genetics, because the genetics, among other things, is going to be one of the windows we use to why and to help us individualize people's treatment. When I had the treatment center, we already used genetics to individualize people's medical treatment, but we can do it even before addiction happens. And to do that, there's fear. Like, why would I want to get my kid genetically tested? Then someone's going to be prejudiced against them, or it'll end up like a bad sci-fi movie. So what we're going to need is a way to keep people's privacy intact. And luckily, all that stuff you hear about blockchain, that's going to be really important to create a health record for you that doesn't get shared with anyone but you, or people you want to share it with. If you want to sell your data to Dow Chemical, you have that right. If you don't want this doctor to see that part, you have that right. It's yours completely. That's being built right now by a number of different blockchain projects. And very quickly, it's going to be out there. So privacy, genetics, and more science besides genetics. After genetics, we'll have other science too. And a new treatment system that puts the patient first and puts the disease first and stops focusing on the drug. That's going to get us a huge movement. All those recovering people who now are not going to get into recovery, who would be in recovery, the funny thing I've noticed about recovering people is they create more recovering people. You know, it's sort of like people come up to them and say, what happened? And you tell them, and then they go, I want that. So here's how I did that. And so it could, instead of spiraling up, instead of spiraling down, we'll be spiraling up. We can take how much do you realize we spend $6 billion in this country only on treatment? Wow. Not on law enforcement, not on jails. I mean, that's even more. Just on treatment, we spend $6 billion a year. If you start to cut that expense, where does that money go? That money could go back into better prevention, better treatment. That's why I said a few years ago, in 30 years. I think it'll be quicker than that.
Wow. So you feel like it's starting to catch on and take flight?
No. And that's why, I mean, I just came back from the American Society of Addiction Medicine meeting, and I came back a little depressed. Oh, no. Because not one presentation on genetics, not one presentation on precursors, real prevention other than just say no. Yeah. Nothing about individualizing treatment the idea about individualizing treatments, we're going to offer 2 treatments and you get to pick which one you have. That's not individualizing treatments. The ability to say, this is the right thing for you and this is the right thing for you, or likely that is the right thing for you. That's individualizing treatment. And the people I talked to were very little interested in that. It was all about the federal government is giving opioid money and let's go get some. And it's almost like the field forgot that the goal was to get rid of addiction, period. And so, no, I don't think it's catching on, which is why the new venture I'm doing isn't treatment. I want to do education about genetics, not only for addiction. Addiction is going to be first because that's my passion, but after that, we'll do nutrition, we'll do diabetes, we'll do pain, we'll do other things so everybody can learn more about themselves and go to their doctor with, wait a minute, when you tell me this this medicine is better for 70% versus 50% of people with this condition. Did you take into account that I have this genetics? And the answer is almost always today going to be no. Why would I do that? And well, when you know more than your doctor, that's when it's going to move. And that's what I want. I would like all of us as recovering people or seeking recovery or people with addiction to start demanding the care that people with this disease deserve. And that's the only way it's really going to happen.
Yeah. So do you, in your work and everything, do you have a hypothesis as to why it is we as a collective have focused on the substance abuse as the issue rather than getting to the disease of addiction? Is it the science hasn't been there? Why do you think that is?
Well, I have a pet theory, but I've got no data because I wasn't there. But I imagine at the senatorial debates over the Harrison Tax Act back in 1913, when they said, okay, no more opiates, and they said, okay, you know what, we're going to throw cocaine in there too, and hey, you know, we're not going to do cannabis right now, but that stuff's bad too. I can just imagine these cigar-smoking senators, because when you read the testimony, it was opiates. It was because of all those Chinese people getting white women in California into sex slavery. We got to do something about the opioids, and we got to do something about cocaine because all the blacks in the South are raping white women because of cocaine. The whole thing was racist from the beginning. It was anti-immigrant, anti-race. It was just the worst part of America. And I can just see these fat guys smoking cigars and going off to have a 4-martini lunch on Capitol Hill, thinking, if knowing what I know about addiction is when I can make myself feel better than you, then I don't feel less than for a little bit. My dopamine receptor density comes up and my symptoms of addiction are relieved. What's happened, like if you did a model, let's give 100 people with addiction the right to make rules for other people and see what happened. This is what would have happened. What we have now is what would have happened. People with addiction would say, well, my drug's okay, your drug's not, because it's annoying me and causing problems for me. And so I get to do my drug, and that's not a drug. We're going to call that good living. The thing you're using is now a sin and a crime, and you're a dirtbag, and I'm good. And so my pet theory is somewhere back in history, a lot of people with addiction went into politics.
Interesting. And I know I've heard you talk about in some lectures that there's not a coherent view of what addiction is. And this sounds like exactly what you're talking about. Can you just explain how that's contributing to this perpetual issue of the substance being the issue over and over again?
Yeah, I first became aware of this with insurance companies. And when I looked at because like everybody else treated addiction, I initially hated insurance companies. And I thought, well, why are they so mean to me? And then I looked at it from their point of view. And from their point of view, they weren't being mean to me. When they went to one treatment center and they said, how come this guy's sick? That treatment center said, oh, reason A. They went to another treatment center. Why is this guy sick? Reason B. And reason C, reason D. They never heard a coherent answer. So they said, well, either these people don't know what they're talking about, in which case I don't want to pay them, or they're all lying to me, in which case I don't want to pay them. Our field doesn't have a coherent answer on what addiction is. Is it substance abuse? Is it addiction? Is it all? I've heard people say it's all trauma. I've heard other people say it's all caused by drugs. I've heard other people say it's all genetics. And I'm a genetics guy and I don't say that. There are many roads. While there's a final common pathway, there are many roads to get there. And so the why the person in front of you has addiction is going to be different than the why of the next person. That means everybody needs a different treatment. But that's too hard. So we focus where it's easier to focus. You know the story of the guy looking under the streetlight for his keys?
No, I don't.
Okay, so there's this guy on his hands and knees under a streetlight looking for his keys, and his friend comes along and he says, hey, What happened? What's wrong? He goes, I lost my keys. And the friend starts to get down on the ground. He says, oh, did you lose them here? I'll help you look. And the guy says, no, I lost them at home, but this is where the light is better. That's us right now. We can shine a light on heroin. It's easy. You shine a light on alcohol.
Yeah.
You see it's there, it's not there. But to figure out why is hard. So where the keys are is where we're not looking. Mm. That's why we don't have a coherent answer, because we're all grabbing the piece of the elephant that looks easy to us. Mm. And we're confusing everybody in the process.
Wow, that's so fascinating. So knowing this as a collective, how can we begin to think about addiction and treating it differently, like as an individual? How can we start to shift this perspective?
More people need to tell their pre-drug story. More people need to say, I don't have addiction because I chose to use drugs when I was 18. Drugs did something to me that I'd been looking for my entire life. Drugs did something for me I didn't even know existed. Mm-hmm. And the first time I used drugs, it solved my problem. It didn't cause my problem. My problem today isn't that I use drugs. My problem today is drugs don't work anymore. Mm-hmm. And I need treatment. I mean, most people came to treatment saying, okay, if they had problems like job or spouse or something, they'd say, okay, I'm having a problem. But mostly it was, when people voluntarily came to treatment, it wasn't because drugs were a problem, it was because the drugs didn't work anymore. Mm-hmm. I went back to my symptoms and I'd like I want a new drug. Well, there isn't a safe drug for a person with addiction. And everybody who's in recovery, everybody who's seeking recovery needs to start talking to everybody else about the experience, what it's really like, not what it looks like, because all they see is fun and games. Mm-hmm. Do you know how many times I would hear when I'd take somebody, I'd be among colleagues, doctors, and I'd say about a patient who had addiction involving sex. And then some smart ass would always say, that wouldn't be so bad. Addiction is a incredibly painful illness. Mm-hmm. Nobody wants it. Nobody goes to sleep thinking, I hope I wake up an addict. We need to tell that part of it to people because they just don't know. And it's not fair to expect them to know unless we tell them. They can't know. They cannot understand the lack of reward. When I tell that thing to normal people, they go, oh, I get it. And it's really easy to understand. In fact, talking to families, talking to people with addiction, talking to my neighbors, I can explain this biology and they go, that makes sense. I start talking to doctors and it's like, no, it can't be that. Talking to addiction doctors is, oh, no, you're a heretic. Get out of here. It definitely can't be that. Anything but that. But so it's got to start with us. You cannot sit still and wait for someone else to come treat you rightly. Mm-hmm. You have to demand to be treated as an individual. And you have to tell them why your story is different than the guy next door.
Mm-hmm. So I know a lot of your research and work involves the theory of constraints model, which is somewhat foreign to me and I think to others as well. Did you want to speak about this a little bit and how you see it as a tool for treating addiction?
Sure. Theory of constraints was developed by a physicist named Eliyahu Goldratt, and he fell into it by accident. He was Israeli. They had a war in 1973. They said, hey, please come help us fix this munitions plant. And he says, I'm a physicist. What do I know about a munitions plant? And they said, well, we don't have anybody else. So he went and he looked at it like a physicist would look at it. A business person would have done something completely different. By looking at it through the eyes of physics, he recognized that there are no conflicts in nature. All conflicts can be removed. We make them up. Nature is very simple. And so every time somebody gave him a big complex problem, he said, it's not that complex. Let's simplify it. And he came up with these principles and he called them thinking processes, and he wrote them down. You can Google theory of constraints or read his first book, The Goal. He's had 10 books. He's dead now, but he left 10 books, and they're great. The first one is a novel called The Goal, where a guy saves his own job and saves the plant he manages. And reading that book was like finding the user manual for the universe that no one had given me earlier. So with theory of constraint, you can solve any problem, because literally there are no conflicts. Wow. And there's always a win-win solution. And I even got insurance company to pay for addiction treatment using theory of constraints.
Wow. Interesting. I'm going to have to check out that book. So I know you're doing a lot of work in getting this message out there through a YouTube series on ending addiction. Did you want to share a bit about what you're doing with this channel and what information you're putting out there regarding addiction?
Sure. Please go watch it, everybody. It's Ending Addiction. If you look me up on YouTube or put Ending Addiction channel into YouTube, you'll find it. We just finished season 1, which is 20 episodes. Most of them are really short. The last one is kind of long at 15 minutes, but most of them are 5 minutes or so. And we go through the biology, go through the explanation of why addiction is what it is in nature. We didn't make it up. It exists in nature. The reason that everybody needs to see it so that everybody can start talking about addiction in a new way, and we can start a new conversation, because we can't do something different until we start changing how we talk about addiction. The words we use actually get in the way. When you say, this person's a substance abuser, immediately a normal brain goes, well, and he's not ill, he chose to abuse a substance. Sounds like a choice to me, so let's put him in jail. And then when you go around saying we need to treat substance abuse, that just doesn't make sense to a normal brain, or a brain that runs Congress, or a brain that has a gavel. It just can't make sense. So we need to use better vocabulary, and the series is teaching how to use it. Why do we change the vocabulary? And then if we have a season 2, it'll be because of feedback, because people want it. And if you do, say that on the channel, so I'll know whether to, because it wasn't inexpensive, and I don't make any money off of it, and I didn't monetize it. And so I don't know that I got a season 2 left in my wallet, but if there's a big demand, I'll do it.
Yeah, for me, it took really complex things that I've read or heard about scientifically as it relates to addiction, and you just really explained it in such a concise and digestible way. So yeah, I've really enjoyed the content you've put out there. So thank you for giving that to everybody.
Thanks.
So I guess we can just start to wrap up here. I'm wondering if there's anything you'd like to share with people about how they can get involved with your work, or just within their own lives, in changing this narrative we have around addiction, so that we can really treat that behavior of addiction as opposed to just going after the substance, which we've seen over the course of over 100 years, it just doesn't work. So what final messages or things do you have to share with people about how they can get involved in this?
Well, I think just wanting to is a good place to start. Knowing that it's possible. Knowing that just because doctors say something, it doesn't mean it's the truth. That's why you asked me before we started, are you sure you want me to call you Howard? And I was like, yes, because when people start calling me Dr. Wetsman, they think, I have to believe him because he's Dr. Wetsman. I don't want you to believe me because I'm Dr. Wetsman. I want you to believe me because what I say makes sense. And if it doesn't make sense, don't believe me. Stop listening to the powers that be. Stop listening stop letting other people explain to you what's wrong with you. Go out there and you explain it. And if they can't explain to you your experience, then they don't understand the process. And if they don't understand the process, they're not going to be able to help you get recovery from it. So find people who can accept your experience and explain it to you. And if you can't, keep looking. The most important thing is don't settle. Don't go to a doctor, sit down, don't ask any questions about it. Just know that I don't have a choice. They're the doctor. They said this, okay. Interview your doctors. go to the American Society of Addiction Medicine, asam.org. There's a doctor finder on the website. Call if you want an addiction doctor, call the doctor up in your neighborhood or your city. I know there's not one in every neighborhood. And interview them. Say, do you believe addiction is a biological process? Do you treat the underlying disease, or are you only interested in me stopping drinking? Mm-hmm. Ask them. And if you don't get the answers you want, or if they say, I'm not talking to you, you're not my patient yet, then go find somebody else, because somebody who won't be interviewed before isn't going to take time with you after.
Yeah.
So that's just it. The biggest thing is to stop settling and demand something more, and it'll happen.
I think that's amazing advice. Thank you so much. Where can people find you? I know you have your Ending Addiction series, which I'll link below this video. Where else can people find you?
So professionally, I'm going to be on genedsystems.com, GENED systems.com, but it's only a landing page right now because we haven't opened. I'll still be putting stuff on Medium, still hopefully on the YouTube channel. And I had a blog, but it's so much easier to put things on Medium. I just sort of go there now.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for your work. I look forward to following you and seeing what else you kind of uncover in the realm of addiction. So thank you, Howard, for speaking with me today.
Thanks for having me.